Fall is here, and if there's one thing I know about cozy gamers and fall is that we're gonna start bringing out our fall cozy game recommendations lists. If you have seen any of these lists, then it is almost guaranteed that you will get at least one witchy game in these lists. Games like Wildflowers, Witchy Life Story, Little Witch in the Woods. In the past couple years, as cozy games have gotten more and more prominent and more multitudinous, we've also seen a rise in games that feature witches or witchy themes or witchy aesthetics in some way. This has really fascinated me as I've seen more and more witchy games coming out. So I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive into this topic and try to figure out why this is the case. What is it about cozy gaming? What is it about witchcraft that has become so appealing? And why do the two seem to go hand in hand? So without further ado, let's dive into this topic. In order to fully understand this topic, I think we need to talk about it from a couple different angles. The first thing I'm going to be talking about is witches in pop culture as a whole and how the portrayal of witches has sort of changed over time. I'm also going to be talking about briefly the rise of cozy gaming and what that has meant for the gaming community and people who have been typically underrepresented in the gaming space. And then of course, we're going to bring it all together. We're going to talk about witchy games and cozy games and why cozy gamers also tend to really like witchy games. The portrayal of witches in popular stories and mythologies and media goes all the way back to mythology. Typically, most witches in stories were portrayed very negatively. They are temptresses that lead men astray. They could be very open with their sexuality or blasphemers. One of the earliest examples that I can think of is Circe from Greek mythology. So Circe was a sorceress or a witch who lived on the island of Aiaia, and famously Odysseus, who was returning home from fighting in the Trojan War, stopped on her island and she turned all of his companions into swine and then basically compelled and tricked him to stay there for a year where they had sexual relations, causing him to cheat on his wife, and he stayed there for an entire year before he left and went back home. There we have an example of this outcast witch who is tempting men and turning them into swine, obviously a very negative portrayal. We also get a lot of instances of references to witchcraft in the Bible. There we get lovely verses like "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," which is going to come back when we start talking about the Salem witch trials. There's also just general warnings against using witchcraft or using any form of magic that directly goes against the biblical God. We also have Morgan Le Fay from the Arthurian legends. She was an apprentice of Merlin who used magic. And what's really interesting about Morgan Le Fay as a character is when she was first conceived of as a character, she was generally benevolent and kind of seen as this like savior or protector to King Arthur. But as time went on, she started being portrayed more and more as an antagonist. In Macbeth, the play by William Shakespeare, there are three witches that are not portrayed as outright evil, but they definitely serve as this sort of like antagonizing force or the like harbinger of bad things to come. And then of course, beyond just stories, we have the historical persecution of people who were considered to be witches. This is an incredibly like nuanced and deep topic that people spend their entire lives studying, but ultimately the persecution of witches in society was often a way to persecute non-men, non-white, non-Christian practices, particularly indigenous spiritual and religious practice, as well as women who just didn't fit the mold of what the theocratical and patriarchal society expected of them at the time. So a big example of that, of course, was the Salem witch trials, which was a series of accusations and hearings and prosecutions of people who were accused to be engaging in witchcraft. This really swept the colonial United States in the late 1600s. Most of the people who were convicted were either women of color or teenaged girls, which just shows you the racism and the sexism and misogyny that was really intertwined with this. Again, that is a whole big topic that people literally write books on and documentaries and everything. That's just a brief glimpse of that. But overall, we can see that throughout the course of history, up until very, very recently, witches were almost always at best morally gray and at worst actively antagonistic and harmful to men and society as a whole. However, moving forward into the 1900s, and as we started seeing a rise in like popular media by way of television or radio, we started to see a lot of more like cute or positive portrayals of witches in society. So for example, in the 1960s, we saw the television sitcom Bewitched, which was a show about a beautiful witch played by Elizabeth Montgomery. She is, of course, very conventionally attractive, but she is a witch and she gets married to a normal guy and tries to embark on this like typical suburban life. But they constantly have these like funny little challenges because of her witchcraft or her practice, and like her witch family doesn't approve of her being married to a normie. So it's a very like positive, charming show, but in the end, it definitely still does uphold that like 1950s, early 1960s suburban idealized life, which is like man, woman, and they're like, you know, perfect picket fence life. But it was definitely an example of a more like positive, cutesy look at witchcraft. And we also have the show Sabrina the Teenage Witch from the 90s, which is about Sabrina, who comes from a long line of magic users, and she has, you know, her talking black cat Salem, but she also hides her witchcraft from the world, and she tries to go to like a normal high school and live a normal life as best as she can. So again, a lot of the conflict in that show comes from sort of the conflict between the normal lifestyle that she is trying to live versus trying to still kind of like honor her witchcraft, but not letting the two intermingle. Another example that I can think of is Wizards of Waverly Place, which was a show that started in 2007. This was very similar in theme to Sabrina the Teenage Witch. It was basically this like family of magic users, and there's this like whole other kind of magical world that is hidden from the main world. And, you know, this family goes to a normal high school and they try to have normal lives to the best of their abilities, and sort of having to try to figure out how to live in two worlds, right? The magical world versus the real non-magical world. All of these shows featuring the good witches do still involve an aspect of trying to hide their witchcraft from the regular world. And I feel like that's kind of a holdover of that negative portrayal of witchcraft. So witchcraft in these shows is still seen, even though the witches themselves are good, witchcraft is still seen as something that needs to be hidden from society. For whatever reason, the reasons are different depending on what the show is, but they're trying to hide it because of persecution or because of the fear that people are going to have of them, or that people will see them as lesser or something to be afraid of because they practice witchcraft. And it's kind of interesting that the women in these shows are having to carry the burden of society's negative portrayal of witches in the past, right? Like they're having to carry that burden, and because of that burden, they're having to sort of live two lives and carry this with them as they go. In general, I do think that we're starting to see more and more instances of witches in media that don't feel that they have to hide that. And I especially think that we see that in cozy games. So we're bringing it back. We're bringing it back to cozy games. So let's talk about the rise of cozy games. Very, very briefly, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on that because honestly, that sort of deserves its own video. Cozy gaming, which is often called like comfort gaming or casual gaming, it's a type of gameplay that emphasizes relaxation, comfort, and self-care. Typically, these games have a slower pace, they'll have calming music or gentle gameplay mechanics. They often also feature themes of nature, exploration, and relaxation, and they're sort of designed to help players de-stress and unwind. I don't think that it's coincidence that the rise of cozy gaming really kicked off around the time of the beginning of the pandemic, which also happened to coincide with the release of Animal Crossing New Horizons, which is kind of like the quintessential cozy game in a lot of ways. Cozy gaming also remains a more accessible and inclusive type of gaming. It's more inclusive of age and skill level and time that you have to spend on a game. And I also think that cozy games really lead the charge in diversity and representation of underrepresented groups, which is a very important point here. Cozy games have always existed. They haven't always been called cozy games. Really, they were kind of more called casual games before, but the gaming industry has typically been dominated by these very intense AAA titles that were aimed at male players, women, as well as gender non-conforming folks in the industry, whether as players or developers, have been victims of underrepresentation at best and sexism at worst. And if we're being honest, still absolutely are. However, in cozy gaming, women and gender non-conforming folks, as well as men who just haven't really seen themselves in the games that have been typically marketed to them, have been able to carve out a space that in a lot of ways caters to them and their interests and their gaming habits. So in the last couple years, like 2020 up until now, we have seen this massive explosion in the number of cozy games that are being released and the media exposure and, you know, just public knowledge that sort of exists around cozy gaming. Cozy games are starting to get their own Steam events. They're also getting their own showcases like the Wholesome Direct, which is getting bigger and bigger every single year. There's dozens of releases each month. As a cozy gaming creator, it really is like a full-time job just to keep track of the number of cozy games that are being released in any given month. And along with that, we are seeing the rise in games that feature themes of witchcraft. There is Potion Paws, which came out in 2020, which is about a little cat that purchases this like rundown house in the middle of a spooky forest, and they start creating and selling potions out of that house. We also have Witchwood, which is this sort of like a gothic fairy tale storybook kind of game about a witch. There's Wildflowers that was released in 2022, which is about Tara, who comes back to her grandma's farm to help her grandma, and in doing so she discovers that her grandma is a witch and part of the local coven, and she has witchy abilities as well. We also have Little Witch in the Woods, which is a very highly anticipated sort of life simulation game about Ellie, who is a witch in the woods. Witch of Fern Island, Potionomics, Sunhaven, Witchy Life Story. I'm gonna put links to all these games down in the description if you want to check out any of these. And by the way, if there's any witchy games that I missed, please put them in the comments so that we can all check them out, because I want to give these witchy games all the love that I possibly can. So now we get to the crux of all of this, which is, why do cozy gamers love witchy themes in games? So I'm gonna go through some common features of witchy games and how and why I think that they appeal to cozy gamers. Cozy gamers tend to love games that are cute or aesthetically pleasing in some way. We tend to like games that involve some sort of like management or resource gathering or crafting, sort of doing these like menial tasks over and over again. So thinking like farming sims or like, you know, coffee sims when you're just like making coffee over and over again, like those sort of things. And also cozy gamers tend to love games that feature themes of friendship, community, romance, those sorts of things. So keep all that in mind. Now, witchy games often have very strong themes of community. So for example, being involved in a coven or serving the community through your witchcraft, whether that's like crafting spells or creating potions. So two good examples that I can think of for this, and there are definitely more, but these are just like two that immediately came to my mind, is number one, wildflowers. So in wildflowers, one of the main things that you do is join a coven, and the coven is made up of people in the community. Now you don't know their identities, and that's an important like part of the game, is the quest where you discover their identities. But either way, community itself is a super important theme to wildflowers as a whole, and the coven is sort of this very tight-knit community that exists within the larger community of the town. The coven also experiences a lot of persecution from some of the other people in the town and is a very important plot point to the game. But that theme of community is just very, very strong in that game. Another example is the game Witchy Life Story, which is a game about a witch who is sent by her coven to this really small town to help them put on a festival. Most of what you do in the game is tasks to help out the people in the town. So you go, you talk to them, they'll tell you some sort of need that they have, and then you go back and you craft a spell or you craft a potion to help them with whatever the problem is. Those sorts of bonding mechanics or community building mechanics are things that typically really appeal to cozy gamers. These are things that are often found in abundance in witchy games. Another example is Potion Permit, which isn't like outright witchy, like they're not called witches in the game, they're called chemists. But what you're doing is you're like brewing potions, you're gathering stuff and you're brewing potions, and you're doing that as the town doctor. So again, it's community oriented, right? Another thing that tends to overlap between witchiness and cozy games is the aesthetics. Now I want to be really, really clear here that it is not my intention to minimize witchcraft as a spiritual practice or Wicca as a religious practice. Just like, however, there are certain things that culturally we tend to associate with a witchy aesthetic, which are things like cats, plants. If you search for things like green witch on Pinterest, you're gonna see all of these like beautiful images of these like kind of cozy cottage homes with like drying herbs all over the place. And I think these aesthetics in particular are also aesthetics that tend to be pleasing to a lot of cozy gamers. Sort of these cottagecore aesthetics, which I find so prominent in cozy gamer spaces. There is a little bit of overlap between those like cottagecore aesthetics and the aesthetics of a certain type of practice of witchcraft. Again, we're looking purely at like Pinterest level, cartoon level aesthetics here, and I'm not trying to make commentary on like the day-to-day practices of people who currently practice witchcraft. It's just sort of like the societal aesthetic portrayals of those things. Witchiness in gaming also tends to focus on these sort of like menial but fulfilling tasks, things like gathering and crafting. So in a lot of witchy games, you spend a lot of your time gathering herbs and gathering other resources and crafting potions. And like I mentioned earlier, all of these things are things that cozy gamers tend to enjoy in games, is sort of those like, you know, chore tasks or those like repetitive tasks like gardening, farming, the things that you're gonna do over and over again. Cozy gamers, including myself, like I find those things very relaxing. And I think the way that witchcraft is often explored in games in terms of like, you know, crafting potions and like gathering ingredients for spells, I think they just kind of lend themselves very well to what people already tend to like doing in cozy games. There's a surprisingly high number of witchy games that are also farming games. So thinking in particular of Wildflowers, there's also Sunhaven, there's Homestead Arcana. I think in a lot of times the tasks that you're doing on the farm will also lend themselves into witchy practices. So for example, you're gardening, right? You are growing crops, ingredients, and things like that that are going to help you cast spells or help you create potions, and then in turn those potions themselves or those spells themselves can be used to help you out on your farm. So it kind of creates this really nice cycle that tends to flow really well. So all in all, these sort of like homey, repetitive chore style tasks that are so popular in cozy games also tend to lend themselves well to the types of things that witches in video games tend to do. I also really just think that one of the things that has allowed witchy games to come more into the mainstream is just the rise in popularity of witchcraft as a whole. The rise of things like witchy YouTube or witch talk have made the practice of witchcraft more accessible and more mainstream than ever before. And while I think this kind of leads to its own host of issues in terms of like capitalizing on that community or the commercialization of that community, I do think that just the fact that witchcraft is more in the mainstream and generally more popular than it was even like 10 years ago is also leading to the rise in witchy games. And in some instances, I think it's that developers are genuinely interested in these practices or aesthetics or this community and want to incorporate it into a game as an act of love. I do think that there may also be an element in certain circumstances of like, oh hey, like witches are popular and we want to make a game that's popular, so let's put witches in our game to make it popular. That's like a really kind of like cynical, I guess, look at it, but that definitely happens. And whether that's something that the developers are like actively trying to take advantage of and exploit the witchy community, whether that's just kind of like an unintended consequence of the way that they're thinking about their games, you know, that is going to be different on a case-to-case basis. And it's really hard for me to like look at a developer and be like, you're just trying to exploit the witchy community. But you know, that is definitely something to think about. And my last point, remember earlier when I mentioned that indie games and cozy games tend to lead the way in terms of diversity and representation of underrepresented groups? Independent, fulfilled, and accepted witches represent the empowerment of historically othered groups. And I do think that there is a parallel to be found between witches as a symbol of women's autonomy and the cozy gaming space as a place for underrepresented groups like women, like LGBTQIA plus individuals, like BIPOC individuals, to find a space within the gaming community and really carve out a space for themselves. I think that people who have found themselves as on the fringes of society or outcasts or bullied in some way, whether that's in society as a whole or within the gaming space, can find comfort in a lot of the themes of acceptance that are really important to a lot of witchy cozy games today. So that's what I have to say on that topic. And witchy games stay on the rise. I love that as we're seeing more and more witchy games, we're starting to see more different facets of witchiness be represented in games. Overall, in witchy games, I would love to see more games that focus less on the like gathering, crafting aspect and more on the more spiritual side of things. So for example, communing with spirits or tarot or crystals. And I know some games like do have certain elements of that, but I would love to see just like even more of that. Feel like every witchy game that is being brought to the table right now is like super interesting and adds a lot to the genre, if you could call it that. But let me know what y'all think. Most importantly, let me know what your favorite witchy game is, because if I haven't played it, I want to check it out because I just can't get enough right now, and it's like the perfect time of year for it. It's so cozy to me and it's so autumnal to me, and I just love it so much. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Make sure you're liked and subscribed to the channel, and you can also check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/Leylandria, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!